Hello and welcome everybody to one of our pre-convention webinars leading up to this year's NACDA 2023 convention. And we had so much NIL content that we had to break it up into pre-convention webinars leading into our NIL workshops that are going to be on site in Orlando. And I'm very excited today to be joined by three fantastic experts in this NIL space so that we can talk to you all a little bit about what we've seen at the Division 1 level so far. And if you're Division 2, Division 3, NAIA, know that we've got a webinar coming for you as well. We didn't forget about you, but in this one, we're going to focus on some of the trends we've seen at the Division 1 level. And so I am going to let my guests tell you a little bit about themselves, but I asked Oliver Luck to join us because he's one of my favorite people to talk to about NIL and who I like to call and brainstorm and bounce things off of. I'm sure Oliver needs no introduction, but Oliver was a student athlete himself and an NFL athlete and then an athletic director. You've worked at the NCAA. Now you're part of a collective for West Virginia. I mean, I feel like you've worn all the hats in college athletics, Oliver. So I'll let you tell what you think is important to share with everybody.
Sure. Well, thank you, Kristi. It's great to be on with Adam and Melia. So I've had a number of touch points over the years with college sports. I was a college athlete myself way back in the day. Was an athletic director at my alma mater, West Virginia University. Three of my four kids played college sports. I've been involved with the collective in Morgantown. We call it Country Roads Trust. I formed a company with a couple of my friends called Altius Sports Partners, which is very engaged with the NIL world. We have about 35 clients, mostly amongst the Power Five, and got 20 some employees now. So I've been engaged in lots of different spaces over the years with college sports. Also have a background in pro sports. I think we'd all agree we've never seen anything quite like NIL and how it's been rolled out, or not rolled out, but it started, let's just say that. And it's gone in a bunch of different directions. I'm not sure anybody, certainly myself included, could have anticipated some of those directions. And I think that, in a sense, is sort of a backhanded tribute to the passion and of college athletics, the popularity of the games, the connection that people feel with their alma mater. It's as strong as anything, right? College athletics has so much equity in their fan bases. It's, in a sense, not surprising that it sort of spun off in a bunch of different directions. I guess the surprising thing to a certain degree is that, what are we, almost 2 years on, or over 2 years on, close to 2 years on, that there still really isn't very much clear guidance from the NCAA, from the sports governing body. They have some temporary guidance and some general principles, but in terms of clear guidance that compliance folks, athletic directors, you name it, coaches can follow, that's in short supply at this point.
Oh, we're going to put a pin in that temporary language. I want to come back and talk about that in a minute. But before we get there, I also want to introduce Adam and Melia from Athlete Licensing Company. I remember Athlete Licensing Company being one of the first companies that I heard about when NIL started. We've had so many companies start up in the space, which I think is fantastic because everyone's sort of come in with this mission to serve student athletes in some way and help them figure out this space and grow their brands and monetize their NIL. So Adam, maybe you can kick us off and tell us a little bit about Athlete Licensing Company and also about yourself.
Yeah, appreciate it. Great, Kristi. It's great to hear from Oliver as well. Athlete Licensing Company, as you said, we've been around kind of since day one. We were born actually out of the intellectual property rights space. So, kind of our sister company and, original founders were in IP rights management in the music industry. We're based out of Nashville, Tennessee. So we've been kind of at this, because NIL under the hood is really intellectual property rights. So we've been at this game for quite some time. So we kind of saw the opportunity, like, hey, one of the music industry is a big bear, and a lot of times these artists, have particular needs and don't have the facilities or the processes they need. Like, this is really the same problem, but it's just a different demographic. In some ways, a lot more vulnerable demographic, right? They don't have a business manager, they don't have an agent in a lot of cases, and they also have like two other full-time jobs, student and athlete, right? So whereas this, the space we're coming from, so we saw a really large opportunity to come in and, potentially, be a service provider that is really focused on student athletes, really focused on protecting them and their rights. And that has kind of evolved. We have evolved with the ecosystem, and now Athlete Licensing Company has since transitioned into more of a software company where we're providing an NIL business operating system. So our platform is designed to help you manage the business of NIL, right? I think there's a lot of great technology in the space. There's a lot of great players. The Altius folks are great. They do a lot of really great work. We see them all over the place. And we're really focused specifically on, the technology component and providing an interface for all of the stakeholders to be able to interoperate, right? The student athletes need a capability. The people managing the collective, they need to. This is a business, right? This is a pretty large sums of money, and this has become a really big business. What are the tools that they have available? What do the athletic departments have, and what do the brands have? What are the marketplaces? There's a lot of disparate components, but really we're trying to build a consolidated business operating system for NIL, so everyone can operate in a transparent way that's auditable and compliant. And we've got people like Melia who are really strong experts that are really informing that business operating system. So we're really excited. We've got some really great momentum, and we're being agile, just like the rest of the industry at this point. Just really trying to make sure that the right protections are put in place for student athletes, and that everybody's getting the most out of this massive opportunity.
What about you, Melia? Tell us a little bit about your role at ALC.
Yeah, thanks. So I am the General Counsel of ALC. Previous to this role, I was Assistant General Counsel at the A&M system. So if you like the Texas NIL law, I had a heavy hand, and if you don't like it, I'll find a alibi for why you don't like the Texas law. So yeah, I've been around NIL since it was whispers around like, oh, this is going to happen. So I've been following it for quite some time. And it's been interesting, like Oliver said, lots of surprises. There are lots of things that now in hindsight I'm like, oh, I would have drafted different language if I could have had my crystal ball ready. But my real passion and why I was happy to join ALC is the ability to truly protect student athletes and making sure that all of our work does protect the athletes in a scalable way. Because like you said, just because this is about D1, we've got D2, D3, and an AIA athlete. So we also want to make sure are playing in this space because it's exciting for everyone, and we want everyone to be in it, safe, compliantly, and taking advantage of it to the best of their ability.
Well, Melia, you teed up my first question perfectly, because I wanted to ask you all what some of the surprises, both positive and negative, have been. But since you were involved really early on in sort of the NIL process and involved in that Texas law, what are some of the things that have happened that you didn't envision when you were working on that?
So I feel like sitting here today, I'm very embarrassed that I didn't see this. I did not see collectives.
Me neither.
I did not see them being like the engine of NIL. I really thought it would be a student-driven aspect because there was a lot of conversation at A&M. We had athletes pre-NIL that forwent modeling deals, or they had woodworking businesses, ironically, that they couldn't engage in by becoming a student athlete. So I figured it was going to be more on that scale. Like, how can we help athletes engage in things that they enjoyed, hobbies they had that they want to monetize? But collectives came along and changed the tune. So that frankly is the first thing that I've been just like, noted.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that, Melia, because I viewed not dissimilarly the situation when this all rolled out, and didn't expect these organized third-party companies, some for-profit, some not-for-profit, getting stood up to basically do the legwork for the student athletes. I thought rather, having played in the NFL and having a son play in the NFL, that you would see more agents get involved, certainly with the top athletes on the football, basketball, baseball, softball, you name it, teams, right? And have those agents doing their work. I think everybody assumed it's going to be really hard for a student, right, who's 18 or 19 or 20, without the experience, without much time, without sort of knowing, outside of going to the local car dealership or the local restaurant for some free meals, right? It's going to be hard to hook up with national brands or even regional brands. So I thought it would be sort of just a massive infusion of agents, some of them, established, and maybe others who were, much younger, right? As this was sort of an entry point for that industry. I didn't see, and I'm right in the middle of my collective in Morgantown. I really didn't see, adults, basically business people, more or less volunteering, which is the case with me, volunteering to help set up an organization that can help out student athletes, fairly easily, because that's the only way to scale that for, the hundreds of kids who are on your campus as a student athlete.
Yeah, Adam, I'm curious to know from you, because I feel like that's how I became aware of Athlete Licensing Company. Was I think you all were mentioned in some conversations around collectives really early on. When you realized collectives were going to play a role in this space, how did that change sort of what you all were planning to do at Athlete Licensing Company, and what were those sort of adjustments you had to make to account for them being part of the system?
Yeah, I mean, we definitely, that's a great question, Kristi. We our kind of go-to-market strategy was like, how do we connect with athletes? How do we put the tools in the hands of the athletes? And it was really about, I mean, and it still is to this day, really about how do we, help athletes? And we thought that we would do that direct and through the university. But the way that the kind of guidelines are around NIL and, student benefits that are, can be or can't be for student athletes, what we found is the practical reality is it's really hard to get the students' hands on these tools, and to boot, like sometimes there's a pretty large missing education component, right? Like I can't go to a student athlete and tell them that their intellectual property rights are at risk and that they need to make sure that they manage their exclusivity, right? Those are really complex, highly nuanced topics. So we had to really sit down and think about, like, all right, who should be advocating for these student athletes? We have partners who are agents and have kind of looked at those, and we're still facilitating those agency relationships. But really, was for better or worse, these collectives, we want to enable the collectives who want to do the right thing. Mm-hmm. And it was actually a really difficult exercise for us to figure out, because there's lots of collectives with lots of different motivations. And I will say that one thing that I was pleasantly surprised as we got into this is that most collectives that we have interacted with want to do the right thing. They don't know what that is. Right? They don't know what that is, but like the motivations that they have, the people that they have involved, they're really focused on student athlete and making sure that they have a positive experience and making sure that they're set up for success. In many ways, they, like Oliver alluded to, this is their part-time thing. They're volunteering their time, and they've really got it underwater, where they found themselves, in some cases having a multi-million-dollar business as their hobby, mm-hmm. right? And they want to do the things that are right. But it was really positive surprise that when we decided, like, okay, this is the way that we can impact the most student athletes in the shortest amount of time. And there are a bunch of really well-intentioned, really positively motivated organizations out there that we can interact.
Oliver, I've got a question I actually haven't asked you before, but I was sitting here as we're talking about this, thinking about the fact that now you've had experience as an athletic director, but you've also now been involved with this collective at West Virginia. And since most of the folks who are going to be watching this are working on campuses, what sort of role do you think that folks on the admin side have in terms of knowing and understanding what the collective is doing and even what their contract looks like? And just to give everybody an example, if you're not working in this day to day and you haven't seen this sort of thing, something Adam said made me think of a contract I've seen. It is not for West Virginia's collective. It is from somebody else. I won't throw them under the bus, but I had a parent contact me, and she brought me this collective contract that her son had already signed. And he last summer worked with a friend of his who's a graphic designer, and he created a logo for himself, and he started creating this merchandise, and him and his friend were going to build out this website and sell his merchandise. And for some reason, his mom was going through his contract and noticed that there is a clause in the contract that says if the student athlete creates his own logo or merchandise during the term of his contract with the collective, The collective owns the rights to the logo in perpetuity, and they have the right of first refusal to be the sole marketing agent for that merchandise. Now, in my opinion, I would have told the student athlete not to sign that. And it really was impacting his ability to do this venture with his friend, and he had to go notify the collective and sort of get their permission to do it. And so as Adam was talking, it was making me wonder, like, what role should the administrators have in terms of knowing how the collective is doing business and what those contracts look like?
That you cut right to the crux of what really is a critical issue right now for the NCAA and conferences and athletic directors, big and small. And there's a tension right now, and that tension that exists is between the universities through its athletic department wanting some kind of oversight of what their collectives are doing, and on the other hand, causing this tension are some state laws and some guidance which sort of tell the university, hey, you've got to be hands off. This has to be a standalone entity. You can't sort of control it. You can't guide it. You really can't be affiliated with it. It might bring Title IX concerns in, et cetera. So you've got this tension. And that tension at some point has to be resolved. Melia, you may be aware of this. Your Aggie friends, always being first in line with creativity, they have set up the 12th Man Foundation to actually help do NIL deals for Aggie athletes who are on campus. And that's a very interesting thing to take an existing organization which is incredibly competent in fundraising. I mean, nobody does it better than the 12th Man Foundation, who also now aren't just asking, Billy Bob for $1 million check for a new, weight room, but are also saying to Billy Bob, hey, can you also add on a couple $100,000 that we can use for NIL, et cetera. So, there's a pantheon of sort of great organizations on the fundraising side that traditionally have raised money for these universities who very well could get involved because the universities really want to have some oversight. The model, think about this. NIL has been around now for a while, and we've gone through a couple of cycles of incoming kids. Would anybody have mocked this up on a whiteboard as a potential solution to the ills that were afflicting the NCAA? Nobody would have come up with this kind of an idea, right? And you've got people that care about their school. I appreciate what you said, Adam. You've got lots of passionate fans, and they want to do the right thing. Sometimes they may step out of line or whatever, but this really isn't a long-term sustainable model. And that's kind of the question you would ask, Kristi, what is the proper oversight role for an athletic department? The NCAA treats a collective as a booster, right? And normally the athletic program has responsibility. They have a duty to monitor that booster. Mm-hmm. But if you're kind of, see no evil, hear no evil, speak no evil as an athletic department vis-a-vis the collective, then it's hard to have any liability for any mistakes or, sort of stupid things that happen, with your collective. So there's a tension that ultimately, I think, Charlie Baker, the new NCAA president, a very smart guy, I think there's going to have to be at some point sort of a solution to have a clear line of sort of demarcation of what a collective does and who mm-hmm. operates it and how much oversight is there from the university. Or you perhaps just fold all those collectives into, your traditional athletic fundraising arm and let them figure out how to raise money for student athletes and come up with an equitable way, between men and women and, all the different sports on how to share that revenue. Because I think, most people that are sort of knee deep in the NIL world will tell you this is sort of an odd system that's been developed. And nobody really would have mapped it out on a whiteboard as a reasonable solution, to the issue of, hey, there's lots of money in college sports, and these athletes somehow deserve a piece of it.
Yeah, well, and it's about as clear as mud. I mean, I had actually had another collective approach me and ask if they could do what Texas A&M ended up doing. And they came to me before A&M came up with the idea. And I bounced it off a few people, including off of someone that I knew was on the NCAA's NIL committee. And everyone I bounced it off of said, no, you can't do that. Of course you can't. So then when the A&M news broke, I thought, well, this collective is going to call me and they're going to be mad because they had the idea first. And now they've lost the ability to be the first ones. And, they actually have still decided not to do it because there were clarifications that came out shortly thereafter that seemed to say that the NCAA wasn't going to allow this. But as far as I know, it's happening and hasn't been stopped. The initial news reports were that A&M had gotten clearance from the NCAA, that they had gotten I forget exactly how it was worded, but it made it sound like they had gotten permission. And then now, what I've heard is that A&M did make them aware that they were doing it, but there wasn't a permission given for it. And so, it's been a little frustrating, and I didn't do a very good job of introducing myself at the beginning of this. I just assume you all know who I am, but I, write for Forbes about sports business, and I have a law degree, and I own business at college sports. And I've been doing nothing but writing and podcasting and workshopping and webinaring about NIL since the day that it started. And I've read all these clarifications that have come out, and I don't feel like much has been clarified. I still am left with more questions than answers. So I don't want to make this whole webinar just about collectives, because to tease everybody and get you to attend our live sessions, we're going to do a whole panel just on collectives. I've confirmed already, we've actually got somebody from a collective that's going to be on that panel. And then I think also an athletic director to talk about sort of that relationship between collectives and ADs. So come for that. And then also, I know as we were talking, I was thinking about this new, presumption that went into place in January of 2023. We've got a legal panel in Orlando where we've got two attorneys that have been dealing with rebutting that presumption. So we're going to do a whole panel just on how to rebut that presumption. So come see us live for that. So I want to move us away from collectives just a little and ask, in terms of the other sort of questions that are still hanging out there that these clarifications haven't fully addressed. Does one of you have a burning question that you feel like hasn't been fully addressed by the NCAA yet?
Well, yeah, I think, Kristi, you hit on it a little bit, and this is a clarification about their strategy, because there's a bunch of guidance, but there seems to be very little to no enforcement, right? Which is, you can look at any one point in the ambiguities of it, but most clarifications come through enforcement, whether we like it or not, right? Like clarifications become from precedent, right? Like, and they're with the only one actual violation being the NIL adjacent violation happening. There's not any precedent happening, right? So we can in the same way with federal and state regulations, right? The law is like you can legislate yourself to the end of time, but until the first case happens, it's really hard to see where the clear guidelines are, right? Even with the Cavender twins, the NCAA stated like, do not take this as precedent, right? They made that official statement. So when you're trying to kind of negotiate these waters, any one of these, like there's still, like you look at the Jaden Gator collective, like there was no violation. I mean, I'm not saying that there should have been, but there was no official guidance or kind of memorandum about that situation from the NCAA. So it's like, okay, well, feels like we're kind of just like, there are these rules, but what of them, and I think that's emboldened a lot of folks. Cause like, hey, there's no teeth. I'm not saying that there isn't or there won't be, but it makes it just really hard to stand against any one of the pieces of guidance.
And Adam, you can say the same thing about many of the state regs that were put in place. That had a disclosure requirement, for example. I don't think student athletes at all are bothering to disclose, deal A, B, C, D, E, F, G to, their compliance department. So, it's and obviously, there's been a handful of states that were very early in passing NIL legislation, but of course, then they've pulled it back, right? Because any restriction is going to put their state schools and private schools as well in a different position, right, vis-a-vis their competitors. So nobody walks away from this with clean hands in terms of having a system. The interesting thing is people forget a little bit. There was a framework in place that the NCAA had worked on for a couple of years leading up to July 1, 2021. There was a committee, I believe, really capable folks like Bob Bowlesby on that committee, Val Ackerman, the commissioner of the Big East, I think Gene Smith, Ohio State AD, and they had put in place sort of a framework that was ready to be rolled out July 1 of 2021 in sort of typical NCAA fashion. And at the last minute, President Emmert decided that he wouldn't roll it out. But nonetheless, the new era had to start because of the trigger in the California legislation, if you remember, and other states by then had targeted July 1 as that date. So there was a system that had been thought about, a lot of work put into it, but at the last minute, the NCAA sort of pulled that, and as a result, it was, we don't need to beat up too much on the previous NCAA regime, but it was rolled out in a very non-existent fashion because it just happened. And immediately when there's no rules, we all know sort of where where the bad things can begin to happen.
Melia, I'm curious to ask you, since you worked on that state law, the state laws obviously were meant to sort of push the NCAA to do something. And if not, at least the state laws would be in place to allow for NIL. Do you think that the state laws still play a role and that the ones that are out there should remain?
And it's interesting because in a way, it kind of depends on where you're sitting, like what seat you would want to be in, whether you would want state laws to remain or whether you want a federal law. If I was a big fish in a small pond or even a big fish in a big pond, but had a lot of pull at my state capital, I'm probably going to want a state law to stay because I'm going to be able to pull levers if possible. So that's kind of also what makes it complicated here, is because the motivations, even in legislating, tends to kind of blow in the wind of where you sit. One thing you kind of have to appreciate about state laws right now is they're trying to protect their own institutions against the ambiguity that the NCAA has set up. The idea that there can't be violations against it. Now, what's going to become interesting is because something is illegal doesn't mean it can't be regulated. So if it gets regulated and it's illegal, what's going to happen? I fundamentally don't know. And this also kind of going back a little bit to what we were talking about earlier, when I was at A&M, we would always kind of be in an interesting seat in the early days of NIL because it was you could look at a contract that was disclosed, which yes, they're sometimes few and far between, but early days, we got lots of disclosures. And we could say that is illegal under the state law, but you could be that's not a great, I can't make a comment on this clause because I'm not your attorney, but shoot, there were times that I felt guilty. I went to advise the student athlete that this is a bad deal, but I fundamentally couldn't because of my role and where I sat. And so that also is another interesting aspect of, where are we going to draw lines, even if state laws change, if NCAA laws change, as things move in-house, how does that change the component? So, I did not answer your question is what I didn't do. I just raised more questions.
Well, that's par for the course with NIL. Well, Oliver, I know you and I have had lots of conversations about whether something's coming at the federal level or not, and you speak to even more people than I do about it. Where do you stand on that right now?
Yeah, well, first of all, I'm not a political expert. I try to follow as a good citizen, what's happening in our nation's capital. It's clearly a very divided, House and Senate with tiny majorities. There's talk of lots of federal legislation. There have been a number of bills introduced over the last 4 or 5, 6 years. The one that people are waiting on, and they've been waiting on it, really for 6, 7 months, is the so-called Tuberville Manchin bill. That's a Republican and a conservative Democrat coming together. I just think that industries that go to Washington to have their problems solved don't end up with their problems being solved. They may solve 2 or 3 problems, but on the flip side, politics is a game of give and take, and they're going to be given something that they maybe really don't want, right? So what that is, I don't know. but it's hard for me to imagine that the NCAA's solution for all of this is just going to Washington. I mean, keep in mind, we talked about, collectives, and we talked about NIL, but there are other issues like employment status for student athletes, and how do you handle that? Is that a bigger concern than NIL? So there are, do we want, do we, if employment status is going to be a thing, how is Title IX affected? Is Title VII all of a sudden the federal law that would be put in place? Because that's really the employment law more so than Title IX, which is about education. How do we, workers' comp? I mean, you talk about a complex system, and I'm a former athletic director, and my former colleagues are very bright people, but think about a workers' comp system that has to be put in place for 500,000 student athletes. I mean, there's all sorts of issues that actually might be more important than NIL, right?
Yeah.
So, you've got to pick and choose what battles you fight. And I just think that, federal legislation is not likely. I mean, certainly there's a chance something could happen, but it seems to me that President Baker and others could spend a lot of time trolling the halls of Washington, D.C., talking to representatives, senators, supporters, detractors, you name it. And it may be, for naught, quite honestly. And when there's so many things that should be done and need to get done in Indianapolis in terms of the, over 1,000 schools that are members of the organization.
I want to circle back on something we've all sort of mentioned at one point or another around education for student athletes. It's interesting because I went to NIL Summit last summer, which was largely attended by student athletes. There were, I think, 350, 400 student athletes. And a lot of them came to me and said, my school's not doing anything. They're not helping me learn anything about NIL. And some of them who were telling me these things, I knew exactly what their schools were doing. And that wasn't exactly the truth. I knew that they had in-person speakers. I knew they had done deals with, the Open Doors and the influencers of the world, and they had education programs that were available, through videos they could get on their phones that were, little 5-minute videos that they weren't watching. Then I went to NACDA a month later, and I had all these athletic administrators saying, we're doing all this stuff for student athletes and they aren't taking advantage of it. And so there's obviously some sort of gap between what student athletes want and maybe what they need that they don't even know that they need, and what schools are providing. So I'm curious to see what you all think in terms of where we're at on education and where it's falling short and how we can start solving those problems.
Yeah, I mean, I have a little bit of a unique perspective because I've been in the software space, so I think about this a little bit differently. I think about adoption, right? If you in any kind of program or any kind of benefit, the adoption is your key metric, right? And if you design a program and you neglect adoption and you neglect your target audience, you're just never going to get the value out of it, right? The last company I worked for was a blue collar worker. And blue collar workers hated technology. We had a mobile app, and it was just another thing, right? Just another app on their phone, just another video to watch. And I think what universities have to do, and all of us in this space have to do, is when you think about these programs and you think about these benefits, they have to be on the job training. A student athlete is not going to care about exclusivity until they get a contract that has exclusivity. Right. And as a matter of fact, they actually don't need to know. Right. You're just giving them something else to think about or something else for them to forget. So I think these in-person trainings are good. They're going to create that foundational understanding, that frame of reference for them. But we have to, from an adoption perspective, we have to go farther than that. We have to think more practical. These people have 2 full-time jobs already. So are they going to remember all the details of the exact nuances of an exclusivity in detail? No, they're not going to remember that, but they're going to remember that was a thing. And you need to be at that moment in time. You need to have that hook at that moment in time where they need that information, or they need that support, or they need that guidance. You can't stop with, hey, we give them a class, because we've all taken online classes. We've all taken those. I was in the military for a decade, and the annual compliance training that we all had to do and sit through the PowerPoints, and everybody hated it. No one remembered anything, right? It was those moments in time, those training moments, those mentoring moments. And I think our programs have to be focused on those moments in time where they need the support, structure program around those alongside of your standard kind of, I'm going to train these, I'm going to give this classroom style education, or I'm going to assign these online courses.
Well, what I would say, but go ahead, Melia.
Well, I was just going to add, I think one of the things I learned at A&M when we did a climate survey was that athletes spend so much more time with their trainers and their academic advisors. So the more individuals that we can even train up in an athlete's touch point during a day is actually that in a way leverages more of the FTEs you have towards NIL. Like if you only have one FT, like a director of NIL or someone kind of other duties as assigned now, that kind of leverages them and makes them a force multiplier across the athlete's touch point. And it's not kind of another place that they have to go see someone. So sorry, Oliver.
Well, I was just going to say, there's a sort of a contrarian point of view for all of this, which is student athlete, you've got an opportunity that wasn't available, for the last, 100 years to previous student athletes. You have a chance to make money. Guess what? Do what adults do, which is if they don't know something, they go to a lawyer. They, call up an accountant. They pay $100 an hour or $200 an hour or whatever. Now, this may not be worth it, for free pizza, every Friday evening, or for, $100 fee. But if there are sort of, what I would call 6-figure, 5-figure, 4-figure deals, do what I do, or probably what most of us. I'm a lawyer like Kristi, Melia like you, and we probably go. If I don't know anything about bankruptcy law, if I'm in a bankruptcy case, I've got to go hire a bankruptcy expert, right, and pay that person. Or if I need to get my taxes done and I really don't understand how to do it first or second time because now I'm an independent contractor, I need to make sure I'm getting the W-9. And I'm going to go to an accountant. So with this opportunity, I think comes some responsibilities. And, the schools are going to be limited. They cannot give legal advice. They don't want to give legal advice. And, you can set up, law school clinics, I suppose, to help out and educate a little bit. But, nobody teaches you how to buy a house, but you sort of figure out, well, I got to go to a realtor and I can ask the realtor a bunch of questions, but that realtor is getting paid, by both the buyer and the seller, typically. So, there's a little bit of a contrarian view. Hey, this is a great opportunity, and if you want to make money, that's fine. But there's a way to do it that's proper, and but it may cost you a little bit. You have to think like a business person, right? Is it worth going to that lawyer when I'm really asking him about a $50 deal? And the answer is no. So that's just something to sort of keep in mind because it's going to be very difficult for a typical school to staff up to handle, the questions from 300, 400, 500 student athletes. And they really, they shouldn't be asking the schools for that information, right? That they have to sort of learn a little bit.
I thought maybe to end it, we could each go around and say something we're kind of keeping our eye on with NIL. Like what's that next thing that we're waiting to happen or that we think is going to become more important in this space? So I'll start with mine to give you guys a chance to think about it, although I don't want to steal what any of you might want to say, but and I've got two. So if nobody hits my other one, maybe I'll come back to it at the end. But I've been really paying more attention lately to group licensing because I'm seeing more and more schools sign deals with the Brandar Group and One Team and some of the other folks that are in that group licensing space. But, for all of the sort of gloom and doom around how NIL might take money away from athletic departments because a sponsor might decide to do a deal directly with a student athlete instead of with the athletic department. I mean, frankly, I have not heard about much of that happening. But I think there's opportunities to create new revenue streams with co-branded opportunities. And I know Kansas did it last year with a group called Mercury, where they created some co-branded NFTs. And beyond the NFTs, there were other things happening in the community that got built with fans who bought those NFTs for the athletic department to continue marketing to them and making offers to them. I think it was inside of a Discord community, if I remember correctly. But I think there are new revenue opportunities on this co-branded path although I think you have to be careful about Title IX, and we could do a whole separate webinar about Title IX issues. But group licensing to me has a lot of opportunity for student athletes and for athletic departments. So I've been keeping my eye on that. And I talk to the folks at Brandar Group, I don't know, every few weeks, because that's how fast it's been changing. So that's my one. Does anybody else have something ready to go?
Yeah, I have something that I think is one inevitability, and I think would be really healthy and exciting for the ecosystem. And I think that is division-wide transparency. I know early days, NCAA was talking about having a kind of sort of pseudo clearinghouse for NIL deals, and I think, you know, at least from the point of frustration for a lot of folks, like, it's just unclear what's happening, and there's not clear on the rules. It's not like, but I think, you know, eventually there's going to emerge a way for there to be real transparency about all the deals that are actually happening. Like, hey, because you got like the On3s and the folks like that are reporting these deals and these activities, and it's kind of unclear to, you know, third parties or external folks, like, how real that stuff is. You know, what are the real deal terms? I mean, obviously there's privacy and things to consider in that, but really having a place where you can, you know, fundamentally understand the market, right? Everyone says market rate. Like, there's lots of references to market rate and fair market rate and that kind of stuff. And we'll never get that till there's a system of transparency. Now, you can't have that in NFL, the XFL, because those are private and that's pro. But I think because we're kind of playing that amateurism space, I think there's an opportunity for us to say, hey, look, this has to be disclosed. It's going to be anonymous, but there needs to be some system of record so that, you know, from a compliance perspective, from a transparency perspective, for, you know, just the health and welfare of the division and for the NCAA, I think having that in place would really, really benefit everyone. And I think it's an inevitability. I think it's something that will have to happen if we want NIL to continue. And I'm really excited about that. I think it'll relieve a lot of pressure on athletic departments, on collectives, on student athletes. I think that's that kind of the fear of the unknown on what's happening in the market is really influencing in a negative way what's happening in NIL.
Oliver's been working hard on that. I know Oliver and I've had this conversation a lot about getting more data around what's happening in the industry. And I've had student athletes tell me how useful it would be to understand what other student athletes in similar positions are getting for NIL deals, because they're afraid that they're undervaluing themselves when they're agreeing to some of these contracts. So I'm a big fan of seeing that happen too. Oliver,
Well,
Melia,
I'll say real quickly, Adam, I agree 100%. There's no transparency at all, and the real marketplace can't develop appropriately and have fair market value estimations without data. I mean, it's shocking that we're in 2023, the age of big data, and, you know, we see nothing. My issue that I'm watching closely is this: for many years, the NCAA defended its cases. You know, defending amateurism, these cases that were in the federal and state courts, you know, defended them by saying, listen, you know, our fan base watches college athletics because they watch the front of the jersey and not the back of the jersey. You know, amateurism is important, etc. So amateurism is dead, right? Let's you know, bury it and say a prayer over it. It was nice while it lasted, but I'm concerned and interested to see fan avidity. Does it drop off because, you know, Joe Sixpack, who watches, you know, football, basketball, soccer, softball, whatever games, is he or she going to say, I don't, you know, I'm not going to watch this. These kids are sort of, you know, minor league professionals, and, you know, I read that the quarterback's driving a Maserati. What's that all about? Or are people going to say, I could care less what car the kid is driving or what he's earning? You know, I'm a fan of University of Texas or, you know, Sam Houston State or whatever, and I'm going to follow my team. You know, they're good for those kids. They could earn some money. So I'm really interested, big picture, on the fan avidity and whether, you know, the failure of amateurism to survive is going to drive people away from watching college athletics. I don't think it will. It certainly hasn't yet, you know, and we've been, you know, we're now in it for a couple of years, but sort of long term, I'm curious to see how that plays out.
Melia, last but not least, hopefully we haven't stolen yours already.
Yeah, well, Kristi, apparently we're on like the same wavelength, because I like licensing is interesting, because especially like when is it going to realize that like this is something that can be passive for you, like mailbox money? But I'm going to like a little bit deeper is like, are universities going to start investing in the development of assets, like with their athletes, because they can't compensate, but they can invest. So free tip, universities there. I just made y'all a revenue stream. You can call me and ALC and we'll help you get set up with that. But because I don't want to, I'll take a second one as well. Is like, what is the future of the 501c3? Like, is that going to withstand any scrutiny? I'm not sure. So will it need to go back? Will the university kind of take over that space over just the collective? I don't know. I'm not a 501c3 attorney, so that's like Oliver said. I have to find 501c3.
Melia, I think I've read where some of the 501c entities set up early on in this business, right, in this industry. I think some of them at least have gotten approval from the IRS to be 501cs.
Right.
Yeah, we have quite a few now.
There's a bill that's potentially like making its way through. That's like collective 501c3s are not the spirit of the regulation. Right. So who knows? I don't know. And with the IRS hiring up, like, I'm just not sure.
I think it's going to really. Sorry, go ahead.
I should say it's burdensome to remain compliant. So will that kind of trip some up, or, I just think that's a really.
Well, the other thing I'd say about 501cs is, the 990 tax return that a 501c3 has to provide to Uncle Sam. That's pretty detailed. It's 100x more detailed than, an LLC return or, a corporation's return. And that's going to be interesting. And those are about to, get filed. There's a whole bunch of them that, and you talk about transparency. We don't have it right now in disclosure by student athletes, but there may be, a lot of interesting information in these 990s as people file them.
I think eventually or inevitably it's going to fall down to what kinds of opportunities are getting provided. I think, anyone can get, I'm going to make a bold statement, anyone will be able to get that initial approval. It's going to really boil down to, are you actually operating your business in a charitable manner?
Yeah.
Right? Because you can get that approval and be like, yeah, we're going to do all these great things. And then if you're just paying them to show up at your events to self-promote, that's not social good, right? Are you partnering with companies and activities that provide that social good component? I think, I personally believe, as a total not even lawyer, I believe it could be a really good thing. I think student athletes could participate in activities that promote social welfare and provide a lot of value to the community. But the organization has to have that as their mission, right? It can't be a glorified, convenient way to get tax-free donations from your donors, right? You have to really be mission focused and be dedicated to providing the right kind of activities for your student athletes. So I think, just like many things, it's all about down to execution, right?
Kristi, what was your second thing to look out for?
It could be a whole nother webinar. International student athletes. More and more am hearing from folks, from the parents of international student athletes, from coaches who are working with international student athletes, which ties in nicely to group licensing, because I do think there's group licensing opportunities that international student athletes can engage with. But that could be a whole nother webinar, so we won't go into that. You guys really teed me up well with the 501c3, because I almost brought it up earlier and I thought, well, we're going to get into it on the collective panel at convention, because the person I have confirmed from a collective is from a 501c3 collective. They are one that I respect and that I think is doing a really nice job. But we've got some questions for them at convention about that. So for those of you who are going to be in Orlando, please come join us live at our NIL workshops that are going to be hosted on Wednesday, the 14th, for the first half of the day, because we're going to be able to dig in on some of these topics more. And you'll be there live to be able to walk up to people afterwards and ask questions and that sort of thing. So I hope I see all of you who joined me here on this panel in Orlando or somewhere else soon, and just appreciate you taking some time with us today. Thank you.
Sure. My pleasure.
Thanks for having us.